Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'm going to be talking to you about a specific aspect of the ReMEDIES project. It looks at recreational boater behavior and users of the marine environment and behaviors associated with those users. This work specifically draws on insights from expert partner interviews. I'll be taking you through that, some of the high-level insights from that today. This is just a brief overview of what I'll be going through. There's a bit of an introduction to how the work was constructed, highlights, namely the diversity of recreational boaters and users, and that how that impacts on identity. Discussion of the provision of information, education, training, and awareness raising, one of the key recommendations that came from partners on addressing these behaviors. The need for sound evidence and effective communication. And finally, the emphasis on individual factors impacting behavior. This will be summed up then through some key messages and a brief discussion of so what, the importance of behavioral insights in this work. So, as I said, a bit of an introduction to the project. So this work consisted of 15 interviews with internal and external partners involved in the ReMEDIES work. These were semi-structured interviews that covered 4 broad areas of inquiry: anchoring behaviors and advanced mooring systems and behaviors associated with an advanced mooring system. Those were 2 behaviors that had been identified in a workshop previously as being of the most significant impact by recreational boaters on marine sensitive habitats. But we also asked about other behaviors and interventions, both internal and external, to get a sense of what other behavioral projects had worked in this area. As I said, we'd focus on two key behaviors, namely the anchoring behaviors and advanced mooring systems and behaviors associated with those. And then in order to analyze the work and sort of frame the analysis, we used what is called the ISM behavioral model, which I'll discuss when I get to the point of talking about individual factors. So the first thing that I wanted to take you through was the diversity of recreational boaters and users and the variety of ways in which they engage with the marine environment. So in terms of recreational boaters, basically anyone with a boat, and it could be a variety of different types of boats, boat in the marine environment. It might be day trips, they might be longer trips that have stopovers. So that could mean that you're local to a specific place, or you're from farther afield and aren't as familiar with a specific area. Where generally in safe, suitable locations, often the same type of locations that seagrass prefer. Seagrass habitats and rural habitats prefer, because they're safe, sheltered places. Why? Most boaters that engage in these habits, in these behaviors, these anchoring behaviors and mooring behaviors specifically, are not aware of the habitats and their potential impact on them, according to partners. And that were they more aware of the habitats and the potential impact, recreational boaters and users would be considered likely to change. Boaters in this case, my apologies. In terms of recreational users, partners mentioned a diversity of different types of users. You can see them listed there, from kayakers to jet skiers to recreational fishers and anglers. So again, quite a diversity of users, and again, using these spaces in different ways. They might be regular, they could be intermittent, it could be specific to a certain stage in life, very, very, very basically. Again, using spaces where desirable, areas they might have heard about, areas they might know if they were local, areas that they might be aware of because they're popular, again, quite varied. And often these users are also not aware of these sensitive marine habitats, but they might change the behavior again with that knowledge if they knew where these habitats were and the impact that their activities had on them. So why do I mention this diversity? This diversity of types of users and boaters, this diversity of ways in which they use these environments or behave in these environments. Basically, it's particularly, I think I'll focus on boaters for this. Whether you identify as a recreational boater or not, I think that impact has implications for effective engagement with these groups in order to achieve behavior change. So the group that we interviewed, some of them were recreational boaters or considered themselves to be recreational boaters, some did not. And the elements, the factors that they mentioned around whether they identified as recreational boaters or not had to do with access. So whether they owned a boat, whether they boated regularly. They mentioned decision-making powers, whether they controlled the boat. There were divers who frequently did go boating in a marine environment, but they were not in control of the boat. They did not have decision-making powers, and so they did not identify as recreational boaters, even though they were frequent users of the marine environment in a recreational boating capacity. On the other hand, there were boaters that didn't own a boat or regularly boat or keep a boat in a marine space, but still identified because they'd grown up around in and around using boats and would still go out occasionally. So there were different elements that played into this, and that changes how you identify and how you engage with the recreational boater community. You know, the types of organizations you might engage with, how you might engage with them, and whether you perceive a specific message to be for you can be wrapped up in that identity. So understanding the diversity in how people engage with varied communities or don't engage with varied communities has implications for effective engagement. So how are undesirable behaviors then best addressed? As I said, partners identified the provision of information, education, training, and awareness raising as key, as the most significant means for addressing undesirable behaviors. But of course, into that, you have elements of the perception of the boater or the community which you are attempting to, the community undertaking those behaviors and that you're intending to address. You have that diversity within the community. Recreational boaters themselves are quite diverse. Users of the marine environment are quite diverse. So tapping into that diversity, understanding the values, the motivations of different groups and subgroups, how they engage with varied communities, whether that be yachting associations, boat clubs, whatever it is, understanding and exploring how to target those specific groups in order to best provide those messages or information provision, but also trust the source from which the information is coming. And partners tended to suggest that trust was best generated on a more local level from a trusted source organization involved in the community. All of these elements, these factors that go into the provision of high quality education, training, and awareness raising to address behaviors, these are underpinned by the need for high quality evidence and communicating that evidence effectively to the target population. So, what is high quality evidence? According to our respondents, what is needed to provide this high quality evidence? So, the evidence should be longer term. There was a noted lack of emphasis on monitoring and evaluation of existing interventions, and a difficulty then in providing longer term evidence of the success or otherwise of those interventions to the target communities. There needs to be a UK focus and understanding of the significance of certain types of behaviors, the significance of habitats, and the impact that those behaviors have on those habitats in a UK context, and particularly to some extent in the local area, so that target communities understand about the potential impacts of these behaviors. And an exploration of the quantity and quality of those habitats. One of the things partners mentioned in their interviews was that they frequently heard, well, the seagrass is expanding, so it's covering a greater area in this local context. But that doesn't necessarily speak to quality. But if the evidence isn't there to convey the importance of both quantity and quality of seagrass to the target populations to address behaviors, that's a problem. So again, effectiveness. Effectiveness of interventions in a UK context, in a potentially a local context, I think is key for recreational boaters and users. And finally, understanding the motivations behind the target populations, the target groups, whom you're trying to engage and communicate with effectively. The best example of this would have to do with the advanced mooring systems, one of those target behaviors we'd asked about. and understanding the distinction between the use of an advanced mooring system versus the installation of an advanced mooring system. If you have a boat and an advanced mooring system is available and it's a trusted organization, perhaps you're quite fine to use to moor your boat to an advanced mooring system. However, installation tends to be more targeted at groups that own the mooring systems. That tends to be more at a slightly higher level than an individual level. So they have different concerns around the installation of advanced mooring systems. So understanding the motivations and how to tap into that to communicate the evidence effectively. And the evidence needs to cover both the environmental aspects, but also the engineering aspects. And all of these elements feed into what is perceived to be high quality evidence to communicate effectively on the behaviors and their potential impact on these sensitive habitats. So lastly, I said that there was an emphasis on individual factors. As I said, I used the ISM behavioral guide to frame this analysis. What ISM stands for are the 3 types of factors that are considered to impact behavior. In this case, you have individual factors, which are those held by the individual and that impact their choices and the behaviors undertaken. There are social factors, which exist beyond the individual in the social realm, yet still shape behaviors. And then there are the material factors, which are out there in the wider environment, the wider world of an individual, but which both constrain and shape behavior. So those might be more institutional type of things, rules and regulations, for example, regulation and enforcement. And these are the 3 types of factors. And what was interesting, what came out of this analysis, is that while there were individual, social, and material factors, the respondents most emphasized individual factors. So really targeting the groups, understanding local contexts and communities, and communicating effectively at that level. Occasionally, this was paired with a more top-down approach that came from the more material or social aspect. But there was quite a bit of emphasis on the individual factors as being key in addressing the undesirable behaviors and changing them. Right, so key messages, this is what I've just taken you through. There are a diversity of recreational boaters and users, and identity could potentially play an important role in how different types of recreational boaters or users engage with behavioral interventions. So as I said, understanding how they identify or engage with the different communities, how they engage with the marine environment, and targeting messaging most appropriately to address behaviors in an effective way. And the provision of information, education, training, and awareness raising was identified as key for reducing impacts of recreational behaviors. But there are considerations around effective communication, engagement, and trust. Again, targeted messaging that speaks to the motivations and values of the audience in question, and that particularly that it is a trusted source delivering that information. And of course, all of this needs to be underpinned by sound evidence that speaks to the concerns, again, of the group of the recreational boaters or the users in questions. Sound evidence is particularly key in addressing potential misconceptions, and it must include longer-term data, a UK focus, potentially a local context, and both environmental and engineering elements to speak to the motivations, again, of the group in question. And finally, individual factors are emphasized, particularly communication at an individual level, with targeted information for varied groups across the recreational boating and user community, and informing a more bottom-up approach. Again, paired to some extent with the top-down approach, but emphasizing that targeted communication at that individual level. So what? So behavioral change was identified as a key element of achieving reduced impacts of recreational boaters and users on sensitive marine habitats. And again, the provision of information, education, and training opportunities, as well as awareness raising, were identified as key, as very important. But these must target varied audiences, including recreational boaters, but also those in a position to implement more widespread change within their communities, and delivered by people with the trust of the community and the individuals, and the knowledge, who can effectively communicate with consideration for the traditions of the boating community and provide that evidence that really speaks to the concerns of the community in question. There are challenges, of course, in achieving behavior change, and those were identified, particularly the needs to consider the target audience and the diversity of values, opinions, and drivers, as well as the means for influencing recreational boaters or other recreational water users. So, yep, this covers sort of the high-level points from my work. If it's something of interest to you, by all means contact me. Happy to answer any other questions. And again, thank you.